I will be talking today in this third installment about imperial conflict in the colonies, essentially focusing on the 18th century. This will bring us up to approximately 1763 or 1764 and lead into a segue into discussion about American colonies during the next lecture segment series. So, let's begin. First of all, with reference to the colonies at the turn of the century, that is between the late 17th and early 18th centuries, basically by 1710, 1720, this is what North America looks like in terms of empire claims. The blue region is the French area of dominance, largely based on the fur trade. Remember, as I mentioned before in the previous lectures, it's not so much, it does not include, that is, New France does not include a massive amount of people, but it does include a vast empire based on the fur trade and very good relationships with the Native American inhabitants in the blue region that you see. The Spanish have been reduced by a number of imperial wars. The height of their power, as noted in previous slides, peaked earlier on. So over the course of the 17th century, for instance, they had been reduced in power not only in Europe, but abroad, holding on to just a small portion of Florida, as well as the Southwest. The British, the most populous by far of the colonies, inhabited what you think of today as the 13 colonies, as noted in the red on the screen. And it should then be no wonder or no doubt that eventually, as population and European claims to the continent begin to expand and increase, that a number of individuals, both settlers and crowns or monarchs of these European states, would begin to clash. That is, they would begin to fight and bicker over claims over the continent. And that's exactly the case with reference to what happens in North America during the 18th century. What I'll be doing is giving a brief overview of kind of the population explosion to set this up first off, and then I'll skip basically to the middle part of the century and discuss the beginnings of the 7 Years' War. So there's no doubt that the British colonies, which, as you can see from the slide, from the Maine to the Carolinas, despised the French and resented their empire of fish and furs. But the English were preoccupied with their own affairs, and they too were divided. And so much, as we've noted in the differences between the different settlements, they had a hard time unifying in order to provide some kind of united front against the French. Indeed, England's mainland colonies were split not only by ethnic and regional differences, but also by racial and religious prejudices. Year after year, small wooden ships brought a bewildering variety of immigrants to the American seaports, aggravating those divisions. Colonials were also separated by vast distances, poor transportation, and slow communications. The frontier districts, the areas basically in between the colors on the map, distrusted seaboard communities, and eastern seaboard disdained the backcountry settlers. One of the largest immigrant groups, 250,000 black men, women, and children, had come to the colonies from Africa not by choice, but in chains, which also, based on the Atlantic slave trade, also created a lot of tensions. White arrivals included many English immigrants, but also 250,000 of Scotch-Irish or Ulster Scots, the descendants of 17th century Scots who had regretted settling in Northern Ireland. Perhaps 150,000 Germans also settled during the American colonies at the turn of the century, and a sprinkling of Swiss, Swedes, Highland Scots, and Spanish Jews. Most non-English white immigrants were fleeing lives torn by famine, warfare, and religious persecution. Many had paid for passage by signing indentures to work as servants in America, as we've gone over in the first two lectures, particularly, as I've noted, in the southern colonies. The immigrants and slaves who arrived in the colonies between 1700 and 1775 swelled a population that was already growing dramatically from natural increase. The birth rate in the 18th century was triple that of what it is today. Most women bore between 5 and 8 children, and the children survived to maturity. This astonishing surge was merely one part of a more general global population explosion in the second half of the 18th century. China's population, for instance, China's population of 150 million in 1700 had doubled to more than 313 million by the end of the 18th century. Europe's total population rose from about 118 million during the same time to 187 million. The population explosion in the British colonies, fed by the importation of slaves, immigration, and natural increase, made it hard for colonies and colonials to share any common identity. Far from fostering political unity, almost every aspect of social development set Americans at odds with one another. And that process of division and disunity was reflected in the outpouring of settlers west into Indian lands and conflicts that took place in the east between vying political factions. As for rivals, not only among themselves, but rivals on a more general scale, Britain's greatest rivals, or the English colonies' greatest rivals for the continent, as you can see by the map, were the French. During the 18th century, the population and economy of Canada had expanded as well. At the same time, French traders pushed into the Mississippi River Valley southward from the Great Lakes and northward from Mobile, which was founded in 1702, and New Orleans, established in 1718, again, all French ports and French settlements. In the St. Lawrence Valley of French Canada, prosperous farming communities developed, and by 1750, the area had a population of about 55,000 colonists. Another 10,000, about half European and half African American slaves, resided in Louisiana, mostly concentrated on the lower Mississippi and along the Gulf Coast. By mid-century, sugar plantations had sprung up in the area between New Orleans and Baton Rouge. And New Orleans, already a vibrant social life as well as an established community, had a number of churches, schools, and government buildings. Nonetheless, the population of French North America, as I mentioned before, continued to be dwarfed by the British colonies. Prejudice against emigration to North America remained widespread in France. A French novel, for instance, written in 1731, known today as the basis for the 19th century opera Mahan, told the story of a prostitute punished by being transported to Louisiana and her noble lover who followed her there. It expressed the popular view of the colony as a place of cruel exile for criminals and social outcasts. Nonetheless, by claiming control of a large tract of land in kind of an arc format of territory, and by establishing close trading and military relations with many indigenous nations, the French Empire posed a serious challenge to the British in North America. French forts and trading posts ringed the British colonies, as you can note by the map. Essentially, it was a feeling that the British were being blocked off on all three sides. In present-day Mississippi and Alabama, and in western regions of Georgia and the Carolinas, French and British traders ended up competing to form alliances with local Indians and control the trade of deer skins as well as fur. The French were a presence on the New England and New York frontiers as well, as also in western Pennsylvania. As a result, for much of the mid-18th century, the western frontier of British North America was a flashpoint of imperial rivalries. Few other places more than the Ohio River Valley. The Ohio Valley became caught up in a complex struggle for power involving the French, British, and rival Indian communities during the 18th century, and settlers and land companies also were included in the mix as they pursued their own agendas. In this area, by the mid-century, resided numerous Indians, including the Shawnee and Delaware, who had been pushed out of Pennsylvania by advancing white settlements. On this middle ground of sorts between European empires and Indian sovereignty, villages sprang up where members of numerous tribes lived side by side, along with European traders and the occasional missionary. And the Ohio country on the map that you see in front of you is actually the country that's marked the Upper Louisiana Territory, or the Illinois country. These are names that are often interchanged, although that's referencing something a little southern on the map. The Ohio country was more or less inclusive of the southern parts of the Great Lakes, as you can see in the blue region, stretching from basically the back parts of Pennsylvania and upstate New York, inclusive of present-day Ohio, Illinois, and so forth. By the mid-18th century, Indians had learned that direct military confrontations with Europeans was essentially suicidal, and that an alliance with single European power exposed them to dangers from others. The Indians of the Ohio Valley recognized that imperial rivalry of Britain and France posed both a threat and opportunity. As one Delaware spokesman remarked, it was impossible to know where the Indians' land lay, for the French claimed all the land on one side of the Ohio River, and the English claimed all the land on the other. On the other hand, Indians sought, and with some success, to play European empires off against one another and control the lucrative commerce with whites. The Iroquois, for instance, were masters of balance of power diplomacy. The British accepted their sovereignty in the Ohio River Valley, but it was challenged by the French and their Indian allies. In 1750, few white settlers inhabited the Ohio River Valley, but already Scots or Ulster Scots and German immigrants, Virginia planters and land speculators were eyeing the region's fertile soil. In 1749, the government of Virginia awarded an immense tract of land, 500,000 acres in total, to the Ohio Company, an example of a huge company of land speculators, or organization of land speculators. The company's members included the colony's royal governor, Robert Dinwiddie, and the cream of the crop of Virginia society, families such as the Lees, Carters, as well as another very famous Virginian, George Washington. The land grant threatened the region's Indians as well as Pennsylvania land speculator claims, who also claimed the area as well. It sparked the French to bolster their presence in the Ohio River Valley because they too claimed it for the French Empire. It was the Ohio Company's demand for French recognition of its land claims that actually inaugurated or sparked something called the 7 Years' War, known more popularly in the United States as the French and Indian War. This happened as a result, as I mentioned, of more than two rival competing claims for the Ohio country. The result was that it sparked a huge, massive conflict between the British and the French that ultimately led to one of those powers taking control of the continent.